with AI dominating everything, producing things that are fast, cheap. Where's leadership fitting into this? Everyone's got this obsession with empathy being where leadership will go. What do you think about that?
Empathy won't be enough. And I know everybody's going there. So machines are organising work, analysing data, pumping out insights, and it's all happening really rapidly. But machines are also producing artificial emotional outcomes already. So the question for leaders really needs to be much deeper than should they double down on empathy. And let's remember, empathy in the work context, it's not an end point, it's a beginning. It allows you to connect. It's a sort of bridge to other people's perspectives so that you can understand them. And there's different types of empathy: emotional empathy, where you understand the perspective and then you also feel it, and cognitive, where you understand it but you don't feel it. And there's evidence already that AI is acknowledged by users as more empathetic in studies, in more than one study, than therapists. So it's already demonstrating cognitive empathy. So for leaders, it's thinking about what they need to do with that empathy and where they go with that empathy and what's the next step. And what that will be about is about exercising judgment in incredibly uncertain times and carrying accountability and legitimacy for decisions, and being able to, through that process, really build trust with all of their stakeholders.
Michelle, you think that in the age of AI, legitimacy is going to be really important in leadership. Yeah. What do we mean by legitimacy?
Legitimacy is the extent to which others see your choices and your decisions as fair and appropriate. So the human advantage that leaders have got extends beyond connecting with people and goes to this area of making choices which are legitimate and credible. And that comes down to three essential elements, really: judgment, accountability and trust. And for judgment, that one's absolutely critical. And that is the ability to hold competing truths and really face into paradoxes, to see a 360-degree view and all its messy contradictions and still move forward. And you'd recognise these contradictions as areas like efficiency versus empowerment, and speed versus fairness, short-term returns versus long-term strategic positioning or brand management. Choices where there's no right or wrong.
So in talking about legitimacy, you've mentioned how it's going to impact judgment and the importance of trust. What else is there?
Accountability, that willingness to hold responsibility for decisions, particularly when they don't go well. And on paper, that should be fairly straightforward, but for some leaders, it's not. It involves some level of ego management, humility, development around risk-taking, risk management. There's also trust, which is really important and generally comes down to transparency and fairness. And together then with judgment, accountability and trust, that makes up a big part of legitimacy and credibility around choices and decisions. And you can see, if you think about it, how that's going to become critically important to everybody. That will be the competitive edge for firms that have that credibility and fairness and legitimacy around what they're doing. And if you're thinking as a leader, what do I need to do to thrive in the future? How will I stand out? It will be around that. It will be around legitimacy and credibility of you and the decisions that you make.
So on the changes that this means for decision-making, judgment, how does this form in practice?
Well, so judgment gets a lot tougher because of the level of uncertainty. And I think some people will be thinking, well, it's been uncertain for ages. We've had this VUCA world, that acronym: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, which was of its time, but became reductive at some point. And actually, we've gone way beyond that. And for those that enjoy an acronym, I prefer, much hard-hitting, is BANI, which is B is brittle. So this is about systems that break under stress. They're not fragile. You think they're strong, but then they break under stress. Think cyber attack, cloud outage. A is anxiety. And there's a few elements of that. But, one big element is a sort of always-on culture, and also how confusing it is, the level of misinformation that's around. And then there's non-linear, N, which is how the consequences expand and extend in a non-linear way from seemingly small amounts. Small events. Think start of the pandemic or introduction of AI. Everything moves in a sort of unpredictable pattern and jump stages. And then there's I, which is incomprehensible. So even the experts are confused. I might be exaggerating there, but they're finding it difficult to frame the outcomes. So that's the environment in which leaders are now, and increasingly so in the future, will be using their judgment.
There's a lot going on then. So what should leaders be thinking about? What should they be doing to respond to this?
Well, I'm an early adopter of AI, and I've really enjoyed AI, and at our firm as well. But you really have to think, and I'm careful to manage the risks around my judgment and decision making. The AI models that are out there, and they will get better, but they will still be using yesterday's data and patterns. And even the ones that are more plugged into what's happening currently, there'll still be a lag. So we're still in a situation where we're using yesterday's logic for today's problems or tomorrow's problems. So it starts with being willing to pause and ask the question, what's changed? Or what might be on the edge case that hasn't been included? And that takes a change in how we operate. It takes a change from some leaders who have got to move from being the cleverest in the room to being the person who's willing to ask those questions and being the person that's willing to explain those decisions. And I'll give you an example. So say you're out on a car journey with a really confident sat nav, and you're going along, and then suddenly you realise that the road has flooded. So you see that. What you've got to then do is reframe what's going on, and you've got to pause. And so the reframe is, okay, we're no longer, going the fastest way. We need to go the safest way. The answer to the problem is not that you've memorised every street and every route. It's that you put some options on the table, neither of which are particularly palatable. We can pause and wait and see what happens. We can go there. We can divert now, take the slowest route. Then you've got to bring everybody with you. And there's other work examples. At the start of the pandemic, there were some firms that took the smallest signals and completely repositioned their businesses. And I don't mean just moved from, although it was big, I say just, moved from in-person to virtual. I mean, they repositioned supply chains, product lines. They went to the edge case. And they had information. They were able to put into the decision-making process information that wasn't necessarily available in the mainstream or in the mean of the bell curve. And the situations where, there'll be an output that tells a bank to double down on a growth area, but there's somebody else in the room. There's a leader with some intuition that a political change might bring a regulatory change, which will change the landscape. So those are examples of how you might need to think about what goes into your judgment.
So if we just take a step back, is all of this just about new skills for leaders?
To be brutally honest, no, it's not about skills. On the surface, some of this looks pretty straightforward. It's about being able to look at what's not already being considered in the information, to identify what's changed, to frame it, to come up with concrete choices, to put some transparency around the process, to have trust built through the process, and to align stakeholders. And it sounds simple, but actually a lot of that takes quite a bit of what comes down to some level of inner work on capabilities by leaders. Leaders, will need to move from this position of knowing everything to admitting that they don't know something without padding it out. They'll need to adapt and change their mind quickly and be willing to change their mind, in the cold light of day without any theatre or drama. It's going to take some real work for some leaders to be willing to hit the pause button. There's a lot of pressure on leaders to make decisions quickly. Rooms tend to have a lot of momentum. We reward leaders that move forward very quickly. And so all of that will need some work on our ego, on our nervous system, on our resilience. And, can you see how those sorts of leaders actually will need a lot of humility? And if we go back to our sat-nav example, it's not hard to spot the flood. It's not hard to come up with the options. What then becomes harder is what you need to manage of what's happening in the car. Different personalities, frustrations, what's the right choice, your role in all of that. And ultimately, there's going to be some real work on leadership identity.
I know that you have some thoughts on the fact that just as we're rolling back on DEI, we're leaning right into AI. Why, for you, are those two things happening at the same time so problematic?
Yeah, boards and executive teams have got these two massive disruptions, some level of rolling back on DEI, and some of that's just in the language. Diversity becomes something about well-being, inclusion rolls into culture, and so on. But some of that loss of clarity around language is actually about a real change and a real rollback in progress. And then at the same time, we've got all of this AI change. And these two areas individually would be incredibly disruptive, but together they're potentially disastrous. And there are firms that will risk being on the wrong side of history when it comes to this. And I could talk about DEI more, but I'm just talking about AI. If we believe that a lot of what will happen with the role of leadership around AI is about legitimacy and is about credibility and transparency and how we make decisions, you can begin to see how equality and diversity actually was in a position of giving us a scaffolding to help us manage AI. And, let me explain that a bit more. Diverse teams are much better at holding the moral weight and much sharper under pressure, for instance, was one example. They're much better at spotting the blind spots that are needed that can have huge ramifications. And so they provide, we've heard for a long time about the business case for diversity, innovation, retention of staff, attracting staff, but actually it's about this scaffolding around judgment and transparency and credibility. And if you think about leaders that act with equality in mind, they're the sort of leaders that are more likely to ask, who does this impact? What have we missed? What are the blind spots? They ask those questions, they move to the edge case, they're more likely to listen rather than talk, and they've got the humility that they need to have to admit, there's something I don't know or there's something that we need to think about again. So those are the sorts of leaders that you will need because they've got the habits that will make sure that blind spots in other areas, whether it's financial markets, whether it's supply chains, whether it's reputational, that those blind spots don't turn into massive missteps. So if you've got an exec team that can't manage a promotion process sufficiently to make sure that they get more women into P&L roles, do you really think you've got the leadership team that will manage the ethical dilemmas and the complexity that is coming with AI?
So AI is not going to save us from this bias then?
No, it can if it was used properly and if it was managed properly. But actually, it's more likely, if we're not careful, to amplify bias. And we've seen that. We've seen that in recruitment algorithms and the way that a number of British councils were using a model that was mislabelling needs for women versus men. Those biases will be compounded. And that's one of the reasons we will really need that judgment, and we need those leaders. And I'll say again, it's not just about bias. Bias is one area of blind spot, but those blind spots can be in every part of your business. So you need the sort of leaders that are looking for that. So just at the point where we're rolling back, can you imagine really some of the leaders that you've got who've got outputs? They won't stop. They'll just go.
So if I'm an organisation and I'm looking at the leadership capabilities of our people. Big changes in 5 years, what should I be looking for?
Everything will change in 5 years, within 5 years. So the headings will be the same, but what's required of leaders underneath those headings will be very different. So take a couple of examples. So at the moment, what organisations will talk to us about is how they want to develop skills and capabilities like strategy and visioning. That's usually top of the list, actually. And that involves capabilities like strategic thinking, sense making, pattern spotting and finding, storytelling. Within 5 years, AI agents will be doing all of that forecasting, analysis, scenario planning. So the role, it's the same heading, but the role for a leader will become about looking at those choices and setting them into a context, which is about legitimacy, about aligning them with values, about figuring out the trade-offs that are acceptable. And, I'll give you an example. Patagonia, on paper, their transfer of ownership and the way they change their structure to employees would never have made sense. There's no way that a model would have spat that out as a number one mean option. It's not an edge case, but actually it was a fantastic move, not just for the structure and because of everything it says about sustainable business, but it really cemented that brand. Cemented it. So that's an example of where the capabilities will really need to change. It will be about, how do I make a choice, thinking about values, thinking about edge cases, thinking about long-term planning, reputation. It will be like strategic supervision. That would be the difference.
With this AI era coming, if an organisation could do just one thing, what should that be?
It's very tough. If there was one thing that I do right now, is that I would look at my leaders and be very honest with myself. Do they have the capabilities and the inner resources to handle what's coming? So you're looking for a level of humility and ego management to ensure that you've got the leaders that are willing to ask the right questions, press pause when they need to, admit that they don't know something, change their minds when they need to very quickly, bring others into the room, ask the tough question, who benefits, who doesn't? And at the same time as there's rolling back on those types of leaders, those are exactly the sort of leaders that you need. And I absolutely guarantee you haven't got enough of them.